Welcome to Journey to Oz, the podcast where we share migration stories from overseas to Australia. We are both registered migration agents. Evan, who specialises in employer-sponsored visas, and myself, Nick, who specialises in family visas. Over the years, we've helped many clients who've had very interesting stories to tell. Evan, you interviewed Reeva, who runs a migration and travel blog website. Can you tell us more about what you'll discuss today?
Yeah, Reeva runs Proudly South African in Perth, a website that comprehensively covers relocation budgets, has a cost of living calculator, and has a wealth of knowledge about resettlement and travel tips. Originally from South Africa, Reeva shares this knowledge for her own experiences of migrating to Australia in 2013 after stints in both the UK and France. I started by asking Reeva what it was like growing up in South Africa.
Oh gosh, that's such a broad question, but I guess it's a hard question to answer because everyone's childhood is just seems normal to them, and it's only when you look back at it you can see how it shaped your life. I grew up in Durban, South Africa, my first few years, and then I lived in Johannesburg and Cape Town as well, so all over South Africa. Got to experience a lot of each city, but finished up doing my university time at the University of Cape Town before immigrating.
And with that immigration, when did that immigration happen for you? At what age?
I was just before I turned 21.
Okay, excellent. So you've gone through your teenage years, your childhood, and where did you immigrate to?
So initially I went to France because that's where my mum was living at the time. So I finished my degree at uni. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do next, but had always kind of seen myself going overseas for a period, whether temporarily or permanently, I wasn't sure. So it was a really good opportunity for me to get into Europe and experience a bit of life over there.
And when you got to France, did you get to utilise what you studied at university, or you were very much just happy to pick up any job that you could as a 21-year-old?
Oh gosh, no. So I did a degree in film and history, which really doesn't prepare you for any sort of career in the world, but is totally fun to do. So after 3 years of that, I still had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. But because of where my mum lived in France, we were just across the border from Switzerland, from Geneva. So she had a contract at the World Health Organization at the time. So I did have a little bit of work at the WHO doing, I think it was like archiving and the video material. So it was vaguely relevant to what I did, but not exactly what I saw myself doing. But I was only in France for a very short period, so it didn't really work too much there.
Yeah, and there's a big stop for you before you went from France to Australia. Where was next for you? And what was the motive for that move as well?
So next up, I went to England and ended up living in the UK for 10 years. And the motivation for that was my mum decided to relocate. So I was either stay in France on my own and figure out what I was going to do, or basically follow her over to the UK. And I did very briefly consider going back to South Africa and continuing studying. But for various reasons, that kind of was not something I ended up doing. And I took the chance to go to the UK instead, which has shaped my life significantly since.
And 10 years in the UK, I mean, what can you tell me about your time there in terms of your life development?
Oh, gosh. So 6 weeks after I moved to the UK, I met my now husband. So
fantastic.
That kind of all happened pretty quickly. And after 6 weeks of meeting, we moved in together, and we've been together ever since. So that was probably the biggest thing that shaped how my life ended up going over there. And we lived in various places between Oxford and Gloucestershire. Ended up working in mortgage administration for a while, just doing various admin jobs. And then eventually I got a job as a business analyst for an insurance company. So that was my last job before I left the UK.
Excellent. And your husband is English as well?
No, he's English, yeah. So he'd lived in the same house for 20 years, and I'd lived in 20 houses in 20 years.
At that stage, yes.
Yeah.
Exactly
so
right.
It's a bit different.
How do you compare life between living in Europe and living in South Africa?
Oh, it's very different. I don't know how much you know about the history of South Africa and kind of the society and culture there. But as I grew up, it was very much you didn't ride your bikes in the streets, you didn't cycle down to your mate's house and play in the park from a safety and security aspect. Those weren't things that we were exposed to. So obviously going to the UK and seeing people on public transport and walking around and, kids riding their bikes down to the park, that was a big eye-opener for me, just in terms of how society functions in the UK versus South Africa.
You've got a lot of clients who are excellent tradespersons, which have come from South Africa to Australia. And as much as they're very proud of where they come from, of course, they're very, exactly right as well, eye-opening and very happy to settle in Australia as a permanent resident and really establish a life here, which is probably the next question. It's after 10 years of being in the UK and meeting your husband there, why Australia after that?
So for us, it started a couple of years, or maybe about a year after our son was born. And we started looking obviously a bit further into the future than we had before. We were perfectly happy in the UK. We both had, pretty good jobs, had a house, all the kind of tick box things that you do when you get married and grow up. Just looking into the future for my son, I wasn't sure. I liked what I saw going forward in the UK. So we started looking around at being closer to my mum, who lived in Ireland and still does live in Ireland. And that turned out to be probably not something we wanted to go ahead with, just because of how hard it is to integrate in Ireland as a foreigner. And then we also looked at it and thought, why are we moving somewhere where the weather is worse than where we're moving now? So we were like, where can we move that's warm and sunny and lovely? And obviously Australia is usually the top of that list. So we started investigating options there and found out that my husband's job and experience was on the skills list. So we qualified for a skilled visa. And then it took us about a year to actually make the decision, because at first, it seems all a bit pie in the sky and oh yeah, we could move to Australia. And then you start thinking about it seriously and you think, actually, hang on a minute, I'm giving up this and, my whole life's going to change. And we didn't know anyone in Australia. We'd never been to Australia either. So it took us a while to consider actually doing it. And then from start to finish, the visa process only took 6 months, even though they told us it was going to be more likely a year. So after 6 months and the visa was granted, we suddenly had 12 months to pack up and enter Australia. So that was all a bit hectic and crazy, but we stayed the extra year. We left it as late as we could to make sure we had enough money behind, or as much money as we could behind us before we made the move, because we came with no jobs, no house, no anybody. I knew my best friend from uni, her mum was living in Perth at the time, and she was literally the only person that we knew.
Yeah, got you.
Yeah.
And for yourself, did you get to utilize any of your university studies when you came to Australia, or was it just start from scratch? And was that when you started your business, or did you have a bit of a period before then?
Yeah, so it was totally start from scratch, because I couldn't even get an interview as a business analyst in Perth because I had no WA experience and no Australian experience, and people would not even see me for an interview. It was devastating. And I've been doing that for 8 years in the UK. And suddenly that was nope, sorry, that counts for nothing.
Yeah.
So that's quite a hard thing, I think, when people come over to Australia. But I've heard similar stories of the UK now as well. Oh, sorry, you've got no London experience. So whether it's just becoming a worldwide thing or an excuse not to hire somebody, I don't know really.
I definitely think it's a bit of, I definitely think it's definitely a bit of both. And I was originally a recruiter, and my first role was recruiting international students into their first professional role. Some of it was the large accounting firms and IT firms and engineering firms of the graduate programs. But it was very much convincing employers to take on this graduate. And some of the people that would have to go through a similar internship and work experience program had 2 or 3 years of experience in their home country. And then they come to Australia, did a master's, and they same thing as yourself, just really struggled to get a job. And I think it is the easy excuse of employers just to say, look, they're not a citizen or permanent resident, or in this case, they've got no Australian experience, so we don't know how they'll go for work. It's too hard to check references, just move on to the next person. And it's a very tunnel visioned approach for the amazing talent that people can have. And like you said, was it 8 years of experience at that time at a BA?
Yeah.
And,
exactly.
the value that you could have brought to a business and maybe started in a bit more of a junior role for 6 months and then jumped into the same sort of level. But you found it very hard. Is that what was the pivotal moment for you to start a business?
No, so I ended up actually finding a job on Gumtree. So I was looking through Seek and applying through Seek, because everyone tells you that Seek is the best place to find a job. Turns out it's actually not.
They've got the most jobs on Seek and also the most fake jobs on Seek. So they're all sitting there, but not necessarily looking to have people. Yeah.
Or sometimes there's 4 jobs and it's actually just one job and there's like 4 listings for the same thing.
Exactly.
So
yes.
I think everyone told me go and seek and look for the kind of jobs you want and look at the number of jobs listed, and that'll give you a good indication of, how available jobs are, and that's just not the case.
It'll give you a false sense of security. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. So I found my first job on Gumtree, and that was in digital marketing, like starting as a complete novice junior. So I went from business analyst to digital marketing coordinator, learning how to do SEO and Google ads and write blogs and update websites. So I worked in an agency for 3 years, and then after 3 years ended up starting my own business. So doing the same thing, but just for myself. Yeah,
fantastic. And I want to talk about that. Now, you've taken your journey of migrating and you've shared it with others through a very comprehensive and I definitely think well-presented website. And it's called Proudly South African in Perth. Can you go through what you do with your website and maybe some examples of like topics and how you've been able to get feedback from people about what you do?
Yeah, so the website started in 2015, but it was actually based off a Facebook group that I started at the end of 2013, which was only a few months after we immigrated to Australia. I started a support group for South Africans in Perth and WA specifically, because there was a lot of negativity in some of the existing groups that I just wanted to get away from. There's a lot of backbiting and nitpicking and people just not being helpful to new arrivals.
Counterproductive.
So I started a group, and within 2 hours I had 400 people join my group. So there was clearly a need for what I was planning to offer people.
You would have been happy with 4 people at that quick, but you'll take 400.
Back in the day, that was a big number to be getting. So I started creating content just for the Facebook groups. I'd make posts of like things to do in Perth and places to go and like nice restaurants we'd been to, and then also things to help people on their journey. If I saw, immigration news or visa changes, I would share that kind of content as well. And then for my job, I ended up going on a one-day workshop with ProBlogger when they came to Perth. And I was so inspired at the end of that day. I really wanted to start a website and I didn't know what to do. And I thought, well, I'm creating all this content for a Facebook group. Why not translate that into a website? So ended up starting the website. It's kind of evolved to the point now where I don't just offer like advice via blog posts. I've actually got a few products in the shop that people can buy, digital products they can download to help them on their immigration journey, like an immigration checklist, a budget planner, and then I've developed a cost of living calculator as well to help people work out based on their potential salary and their family's kind of living expenses, how if their salary was going to cover their lifestyle.
And these are such fantastic tools because they are very real. And there's got to be an element of not just the calculation and the algorithm, but also you've gone through it and you've lived it. And it's just, as it's called, Proudly South African in Perth. So you've gone through that journey yourself, but being able to help others to, take those educated steps, I guess, to not just jump into it, but to also not be too fearful of even looking too much into the journey, and they can research through your website, which I think is fantastic.
Yeah, so my posts are split into 3 different categories. So I call them move, settle, and explore. So the moving topics are all about, the actual migration move, like getting from wherever they're coming from to Australia. And then the settle are things that once they've arrived in Australia, how to work out things. So I've got stuff like what is superannuation. I've got a really silly post that people love called how to put petrol in your car, because in South Africa, we don't put our own petrol in our car. We have attendants that come and do that for you. So I know personally for me, it took me 6 months to have the courage to actually try and put petrol in my own car after I moved to the UK. And my husband used to just laugh at me. I used to make him do it all the time. And eventually he was like, nope, you've got to learn how to do this. Those kind of things that you don't really think about until you arrive and you're like, oh my goodness, how do I do that?
You just wish you had have known beforehand, at least have a bit of a heads up that things can be different.
Exactly. Yeah. So once when I was putting petrol in my car, they shouted at me on the loudspeaker because I hadn't put the handle back on properly and it wasn't hooked on. So it's like being prepared for things like that.
Yes.
That catch you by surprise. And then I've got the settle topic, which is all about things to do and places to go and just explore. I'm not settle. What am I talking about? Explore is all about exploring Australia once you've arrived.
And some of those posts that I've seen on your website, very luring to have look at the blogs, because the covers of them are the nice white beaches of Western Australia.
Yes, of course.
Have some of the best beaches in the world.
Yeah, yeah. I was just at one today, so I definitely won't complain about it.
There you go. And you've got such a wealth of life experience in migrating and living in different corners of the world. And the cost of relocating and the cost of living are two aspects that you really specialize in. How would you describe the cost of living in Australia and in particular Perth compared to elsewhere in the world?
I think when we first arrived, which was 2013, I found that the living expenses were generally on a par with what we'd paid in the UK, with the exception of rent and mortgage payments, which I found obviously significantly higher. We'd come from a more rural area of the UK where rent was not as expensive, to suddenly one paying for monthly rent, now paying weekly rent, which is quite a lot to get your head around when you come to Australia. I don't find that common elsewhere. It can seem pretty extortionate, obviously depending on the area you live in and the kind of the size house that you need. But I believe Perth is a lot cheaper than other cities in Australia. So I would hate to see what the cost of living would be, or the rents in Sydney and Melbourne compared to Perth, or I would imagine significantly higher than what we pay here.
And that's the feedback I get from other people as well, that and particularly Melbourne, Sydney are very expensive cities to live in. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of my first clients, they were in the recruitment world. They were the international students who were looking to find that first graduate position in their first professional role. And they go through having to do like a couple of weeks of an unpaid placement and needing to be able to live and rent in such expensive cities. Not quite easy when you're trying to find your first professional role and someone to be able to take that opportunity on you. And that's why I think that your cost of living, is it the cost of living calculator?
Yes.
And those spreadsheets, I think those are absolutely fantastic that people are able to purchase them in the cart of your website and to be able to get those updates and keep up to date with your blog posts as well.
Yeah, for sure. And the calculator was the first product that I developed because it's probably the number one question that I see across Facebook groups is like, I've been offered a job. This is the salary. I've got 2 kids and a dog. Can I survive on the salary they're offering me if I live in Sydney? And it's always a how long is a piece of string question because, depending on your lifestyle and your expectations and your family makeup, your cost of living is going to vary wildly from one family to the next. So by having a calculator that lists every single potential expense you can think of, up to savings and investments, as well as, just electricity and gas bills, you can put in exactly what you're going to need to pay for and what your salary is, and then it'll calculate for you if that's going to be enough for you. Because, it's one thing having somebody tell you, yes, that's plenty of money, but if you start a thread like that, there's going to be 50 people telling you that's never going to be enough. And there's going to be 50 people telling you, that's fine.
It's all very subjective.
Yeah, exactly. And then people have asked for help and they just end up being more confused than when they first posed the question in.
Well, it's been an absolutely fantastic journey, not just your journey, but the journey of your website as well. I mean, it started in 2013 as a Facebook group that just kicked off a lot better than you would have ever imagined.
Yeah.
And then in 2015 to turn it into somewhat of a business. I mean, it started out as a blog and then having those tools on the blog have turned it into a bit more of a website. And now it is turned into, somewhat of a well-functioning business. So what's probably the next step for your journey, Reeva?
I think for us personally, I'm definitely not moving again for the foreseeable future. I'm done with moving countries and cities and houses. Like I've had enough now. So we
no need for packing boxes anymore.
No, threw away all the packing boxes when we bought our house, and we've been here, I think, 6 years now, which I think is the longest I've lived anywhere in my whole life. So I'm definitely not keen to uproot and go anywhere else. And I think especially with the COVID situation across the world at the moment, we've been absolutely lucky to be in this little corner of WA, relatively unaffected by things, although that is starting to change in the last few days. Very glad we've been here for the last 2 years, basically, and can't see myself being anywhere else. Just continuing the website, really wanting to grow that, reach more people. I mean, it started out as aimed at South Africans who are looking to move to Australia, but really the information that I share on there is valid for anybody, no matter where they're coming from. And the tools that I've got can help you no matter if you're coming from the UK or the US or Asia, South America, Africa. It's all relevant.
I'll make sure that we put in the show notes for the listeners about not just the website as well, but they can follow the page on Facebook as well, which currently has more than 10,000 followers. So that definitely speaks volumes to what you're doing and the type of content that you put out there.
Yeah, it's been a long journey, but I'm glad we're I've got the kind of reach and audience that I have at the moment. And I do get a lot of emails from my readers saying, oh my God, thank you so much for writing that post. That was really helpful. One of them is about what to expect when you write your citizenship test. And I think a few people have emailed me saying, oh my God, thank you for that. I read that before I went and I was so much calmer and wasn't so stressed out. So that's the kind of feedback that I love to hear from people. And then I know I'm making a real difference in people's lives. Because when we moved, there was nothing really like what I offer, I don't think. There was a website called Bob and Oz, which I think still exists, but it looks like it hasn't been touched for about 20 years and it's still like real old school.
Oh, very inactive, yeah.
Yeah. So, I'm glad I started my blog and it's got to where it is. I'm very proud of it.
Proudly South African in Perth is an excellent website. We'll make sure that we put in the show notes for the listeners to come across, and your face is on it as well. And you've had an absolutely excellent journey, and what you're doing is very fulfilling as well, being able to help others because you just genuinely wanted to get that advice out there and have people have a bit of a central positive experience and positive place of being able to find this sort of info. And it's just absolutely grown from there. So Reeva, coming to Australia, it wasn't the first time that you had to start afresh and find a job. And you went through that when you moved to the UK. How would you compare, I guess, not just finding the job in Australia, but working in Australia compared to over in England?
I think that's a really great question because I found that the work culture here in Australia is very different to the one that I experienced in the UK. So in the UK, once you've got a job and you do your job well, it's very hard to lose your job. Compared to Australia, I found that the workplace laws are very much geared in favour of the employer rather than the employee. So I think when people come to Australia, they need to be prepared for that and know that just because you've made it through your probation period, it doesn't mean you're kind of in a job for life. I've had some personal experience between myself and my husband of working for employers who don't treat you as well as you kind of hope or expect, especially kind of from the UK kind of experience where you're generally well looked after. Something that people need to be prepared for. Like it's one thing to get the interview and get the job, but to keep your job is a whole other ballgame.
And did you find that was somewhat of the motivation for yourself to be your own boss and to start your own thing?
Yeah, absolutely. So the reason why I started my business was actually because I got fired from my job for having a personal conversation on Facebook Messenger about the workplace. And apparently that's enough to get you fired here. So you have to be very careful with your behaviour, keep your nose clean, and just be aware that employers do carry a lot of weight. And
I think people forget sometimes that they need to treat others the way that they want to be treated as well. So I think it's horrible what, yourself and your partner went through at various times in your workplaces, but I think it's fantastic now that you're out on your own and you have been for several years and you're able to pour that energy that you have because it's not drained. You're able to pour that into providing valuable information and valuable tools for other people.
Yeah. And I think as immigrants as well, we need to remember that if we are treated poorly, we need to speak up about it, because I think a lot of the time what happens is we think, oh my goodness, I'm just going to keep my head down because otherwise, something could happen to my visa. And sometimes if you're on a temporary visa, it is very hard if you are being mistreated at work, whether it's not being paid the full rate or being made to work hours without pay or whatever the situation you're in. We need to be brave enough to stand up to employers who treat us not the way they should be treating us.
There's very limited protections for temporary visa holders in Australia because, as you alluded to, those repercussions on their visa, their residency in Australia, which is such a big value and a big goal to people. And it was really highlighted to me during the pandemic because in the past, there's always been protections with Fair Work, but not protections with Department of Home Affairs for people's visas. And during the pandemic, it was announced that for temporary holders, they could now apply to have access to their superannuation. And that was about the end of it. So it just goes to show that there was such a difference between the permanent residents and citizens of Australia and the equally tax-paying temporary residents who were, equally human beings and equally working and contributing as well.
Yeah. And the temporary visas, it seems like such a risky visa to take, but at the end of the day, if that's the only thing that people qualify for and there might be a pathway to PR out of it, people will generally take that chance and just hope that when the time comes, they're actually eligible to apply for PR. But I've spoken to families who have just been totally thrown by having their temporary visas pulled out from under them, and I think the laws originally you had 90 days to find a job, and then they went down to 30 days, and then it went back up to 60 days. And so the fact that it just changes at the drop of a hat as well, like imagine losing your job and you've got 30 days to find a new employer, otherwise you have to leave the country. Like I can't even imagine the kind of stress that would cause anyone, especially, you know, if you've got a family and kids who've settled in. And I think it's almost inhumane to expect people to find someone to take over their visa in 30 days. Like it's nuts.
When the pandemic hit, and I won't put my foot in it but there was a large consulting firm and there was hundreds of people made redundant, and I had about 80. I just started with about 5, and then I had 80 migrants who were made redundant from this business because they said, oh, look, we spoke to Evan and he gave advice about sort of where to look for work and what we can do, where we stand legally and stuff like that. And as I said, you know, one person turned into 5 people in the space of a couple of months. I think it was about, I feel like the number 88 or 87 different people I spoke to who were just made redundant at the drop of a hat from this consulting firm. And thankfully, there were high caliber people with a lot of IT background that were able to secure work. But yes, it's not easy that once someone is made redundant on the temporary visas of employer sponsorship, they've currently got, 60 days to be able to find a new job and secure getting that process lodged to avoid being in breach of their visa condition, which would incite getting their visa cancelled. So yes, very much 60 days to find and get something lodged. But that would mean that they get made redundant from their position or they get made terminated, and they can't just start working next week for the local supermarket or start doing some Uber driving. They can't make $1 for anyone but the nominated position. But unfortunately, the nominated position no longer have a job for them. So extremely impractical situation as well, not being able to work for anyone to be able to create an income during that 60 days. It's a very unfair and tight position, which unfortunately a lot of people through the entrance of the pandemic found themselves in.
For sure. Yeah, I think that was probably the worst bit when it all hit and all kicked off. And I think a lot of people just immediately lost their jobs. Yeah, it's like, sorry, you don't know what's happening, off you go. It's like, what?
And unfortunately, those to go first were the ones that didn't have access to the JobKeeper program because they were migrants. As I said, they could access their superannuation in certain circumstances, but apart from that, very minimal protections. So thankfully, we're very much at the other side of the pandemic now, which is great. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today, Reeva. And I'm hoping for yourself that the next time you see a packing box is probably when your son is at that stage in life and he needs to move out.
Oh my gosh, don't even talk about that. That seems far too far away to be thinking about.
Well, a long time before the packing boxes ends. That's good.
Yeah, definitely. Awesome. Thank you so much for having me, Evan.
Done. Thank you for coming on the Journey Tours podcast.
Thanks for sharing Reeva's story with us, Evan. She really has a wealth of migration experience, given that she's lived in 4 countries. Her website contains so many useful resources, such as the cost of living calculator, a budget planner, checklists, tips on how to open a bank account, find a job, transfer money to Australia. You can even arrange a time to pick Reeva's brain and ask her questions about moving to Australia.
I really like Reeva's sense of online community and how she came about starting the page, because she wanted to have a better group than ones that she was coming across online. And it's just grown to over 10,000 followers on Facebook today and a very busy website.
Yeah, for sure.
So, Nick, can you please give the listeners a preview of the next interview episode we have coming up?
Yeah, in the next interview, I speak to Aaron about his journey to Australia. So Aaron had quite a challenge getting permanent residency after having a conviction and a prison sentence in the UK for perverting the course of justice in his role as a police officer, which actually sounds quite bad, but it was a noble act that led to the conviction. And it was actually a situation that had no legal precedence in the UK. He has adopted a child with his husband, and they are now living happily as a family in Melbourne.
I look forward to hearing the interview for myself, and I look forward to sharing it with the listeners.
Thanks for listening to the Journey to Oz podcast. If you've liked what you've heard, please subscribe and also leave us a review. We release a new interview every month, as well as separate episodes to discuss Australian immigration updates as required. So please stay tuned.
The Journey to Oz podcast is produced by Nick Hansen from Hansen Migration, Migration Agent Registration number 1679147, and Evan Bishop from Worldly Migration, Migration Agent Registration number 1679414. Any information discussed in this podcast is made available for entertainment purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for professional advice. We do not make any guarantee or accept any responsibility for the accuracy and completeness of any of the information discussed. You should obtain advice from a registered migration agent or an immigration lawyer before acting on any of the content discussed in this podcast. You can find a list of registered migration agents by visiting mara.gov.au. The information contained within this podcast may not be reproduced without our prior written consent. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of land throughout Australia and pay respects to their elders. We extend that respect to all Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders today. Thank you for listening.